Holy smoke, what's with the music? It's
Very
wonderful to
fancy.
be here with you. Actually, it's not wonderful. My wife is very upset this morning because today we are married for 27 years. And
Woo!
hang on. And just to cheer her up, you know, because she was obviously fairly miserable that I couldn't do breakfast at home, just to cheer her up, I said to her, you realize that this is the same number of years that Mandela was in prison. Oh, Lord. Yeah. I was not comparing my marriage to incarceration, but in any event, thank you very much for inviting me. I was listening very carefully to your colleagues speak, and I said, what the hell did he just say? You know, I feel uncomfortable amongst wealthy people, you know, but you do an important job, I'm sure. I just need to figure out what it is. So, so as somebody who grew up, I was born in Montague, that's right, but I grew up on the Cape Flats in Steenberg and Retreat, so few things scare me. I mean, I can sleep through a crisis, no matter what goes on in the world, and so on, except for one thing, and that is the state of education, because in your language, this is about human capital. This is about how you ensure that you are replaced with people who are competent, who are resilient, who are compassionate, who are understanding, who can compete anywhere in the world in your disciplines. And that is, for me as a teacher, as a professor, as somebody who is deeply concerned about the state of our schools and increasingly also the state of our universities, such as the ones around the corner here, I worry. I really, really worry. As somebody who's about to have my first grandchild on the 1st of March, I'm really excited. My son called me and said, what should she call you? And I said, not all these stupid South African names like Oma and Upa and Pa and Ma. Just have the kid call me Nasty C. But that's another. But I worry. I worry about my grandchild and whether she has a future in South African education. And I say that as somebody who works 18 hours a day to make sure that your children, all our children, get a good quality education in a relatively secure environment, and I'm not sure that is going to be the case for much longer. So what you need to know about education in our country is, first of all, as if you didn't know this, it is highly unequal. And so I can go in KZN within 30 minutes from one of the most well-endowed schools in the world, and 30 minutes later, I'm in a mud hut school, and I can't figure that out. Because you see, somehow you've got to live with your conscience. You've got to sort of try and figure out what sustains this incredible inequality, because I grew up in a context where your child does not do well until everybody's child does well. That's how I grew up. That was the value set of my parents. So I see things like this, and I worry. Now, you could make the argument, as I will in a minute, that simply changing the infrastructure just does not change the educational outcomes for children, and that is true. But there is something called social justice. There is something called fairness, and this is clearly not fair. In terms of those educational outcomes, this is data we just looked at the other day. Just imagine. So your Minister of Basic Education lies to you every January when it's true, she lies, because she tells you that things are getting better by virtue of the fact that the matric results improved by a percentage or two. What she's not telling you, first of all, is that 500,000 kids who started in grade 2 don't reach grade 12. Okay, what she's not telling you is that in terms of educational outcomes, this is what we're looking at. What she doesn't tell you is that the pass rate in South Africa is so low by international standards that you can pass 3 subjects with 30% and another 3, including a home language, with 40%. I don't know, you know, I didn't grow up in the best schools in the country, but there was an understanding, okay, that a standard had to be achieved in order for the children to do well. For those of you not in education, let me just say this very quickly. When you look at schools. Now, I just gave a week of lectures to the most expensive school in the world. It's called Castellia Girls High School in Palo Alto, California, right across the road from my old university, where Steve Jobs sends his kids and all of his daughters, and so on and so forth. And I looked at those children, and I looked at the most dysfunctional school in the country, which is Oscar Mpeta in Nyanga, and I say to myself, there's absolutely no difference between the kids at Castellia and the kids at Oscar Mpeta. The only difference is the structure of opportunity. If you provide the opportunity, the kids perform. Children are the dependent variable. What they do depends on what we do. And so the fact that kids at Westerwood and Sachs and Bishops do very well in this kind of performance doesn't mean that the children elsewhere cannot do as well. But that's the thing. We probably have the weakest performing school system in the world. You need to know that. And I do most of my research in Mozambique, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, and I'm always amazed when I go to Mozambique, which, when you go to the schools, you still see the bullet holes in the walls from the war with Renamo, but the kids are there on time, the teachers are there on time, teaching happens, learning happens, but in this country, where we spend more money than any other country on the continent, with possibly the exception of Botswana, on education, both in relation to GDP, percentage of GDP, but also in relation to the share of national government expenditure. We spend more, and we get the weakest results, and the question, of course, is why. But this scared the hell out of all of us when the polls report came out a couple of weeks ago, led by one of my former colleagues at the University of Pretoria, Sarah Howe, which showed that almost 8 out of 10 kids cannot read in grade 4 for understanding. They make sounds, they don't know what they're reading. And that is scary, because that has implications, as you know, not just for languages, but also for learning across the curriculum. The primary problem is not money, as you can see from this graph, and this is where the teacher in me has to come to you and check out whether you're still awake. I did this the other day, by the way. I taught all the first years at the University of the Free State in a core curriculum we designed, and it's very interactive, Socratic teaching, blah, blah, blah. And I came to this kid, and she didn't realize I understood Afrikaans, and as I put the mic in front of her, she said, "Ag Here, mag hierdie plaag net verbygaan." May this plague just pass over me. Never thought of myself as a plague. So what does that graph say?
It tells you, from a South African point of view, how bad we are in performing with the rest of the world.
Yeah, that is fairly obvious, sir. You clearly a UCT graduate. Sir, could you be more specific?
Well, we spend a lot of money and we get a very poor outcome.
So if you look at the vertical axis, you can obviously see that we perform very poorly, but we spend much more than most countries on education. Now, that means there's an efficiency problem. In other words, it's not the inputs. So formally, we actually have equalized educational expenditure at the level of inputs, formally. But in relation to the outputs, obviously, it's a disaster. And the question is what happens in that black box? What happens between inputs and outputs? Here's another way of looking at the inefficiency problem. And as you can see, of the 100 kids that start school in South Africa, only 4 of them will get a degree, and that's within 6. These are not medical students. These are students enrolled for 3 degrees. Now, that is highly inefficient, and what that also means is, just in terms of my business, that when students protest, and I suppose they should, and they say, we need more black professors, which we should have, where are they going to come from? Of the 1,200 PhDs South African universities produce every year, most of them are from other African countries, which is good, by the way, that they're from other African countries, but it is bad in that you don't resolve the national question. And the reason is the pipeline is so incredibly weak. Here's the really bad news. This government of ours has done very little to improve things over 20 years. And one of the reasons is the ineffectiveness of government policy, and that has caused major havoc in schools. So take the long view. Now, this for me is a very striking comparison. If you looked at per capita expenditure by race in the 1980s, for those of you who still believe in race, this is more or less what the picture looked like at that time. And if you fast forward to today, oops, sorry, what did I miss? Anyway, I'm missing a few slides there. But if you fast forward to today and you look at the mathematics results last year in 2017, then it almost perfectly matches, okay, in terms of performance, what you see here, with one exception, and that is in efficiency terms overall, Indian schools, the former Indian schools, do much better than the white schools. But in terms of mathematical outcomes, you can map it against expenditure years ago. And so nothing has changed in relation to what we try to achieve with respect to education, equality in education. Now, what should you do? A lot of companies invest massively in education outside, obviously, of government. I work with a number of those companies, including Toyota Teach in KwaZulu-Natal, and many other programs heavily funded, and so on. And one thing that you must not do is put money into education and hope the problem goes away. In other words, you have to invest in those things that work and insist on evidence that it does work. Not in relation to whether the teachers are happy, not in relation to things that have anything to do other than with the test of an improving school system, which is learner outcomes. Do the kids know more and better as a result of intervention X? Short of that, it really doesn't matter. You can't do the work of government. Too many businesses put money into infrastructure. I don't think you should. I think that's the role of the government. Whether they do it or not is another question. Or salary inventions, I don't see what the point is. And then you have to look for scale. There are 29,000 schools in our country. 80% of them are dysfunctional. The 20% that are now functional are not just white schools, they're largely integrated schools, and the black kids who get in there are the kids who get in there on the basis of their parents' ability to pay, or because somebody funded them. But by and large, that's a very small part of the national picture, and so you have to figure out how to make all of the other schools work. Now, unfortunately, the only way you can really turn around 80% of those 29,000 schools is with a government that cares. And I'm firmly convinced that this government doesn't care a shit about the education of poor people. So instead of raising the standard, they do everything possible to make it easier for kids to get through and to therefore claim that things are getting better. I fret over a subject called mathematical literacy, which is really math for dummies. You know, the truth is, every kid can, and I hope there's nobody here. If your kid is doing math lit, please stand. I had this horrible experience the other day. I went to speak at a school. I won't mention the name of the school. It's not too far away. It's a boys' school, very, very wealthy school. In the Rondebosch. And no, I won't mention the name. And as I walked to address the parents of the school, the principal said to me in a very English way, you know, I sort of like the way people talk to you in English from another country. And he said, Professor Jansen, I don't mean in the slightest to even begin to suggest to you what you should say. In Afrikaans, don't just say moenie kak praat nie, but here it is. It is a long twist, you know. And he said, please don't say anything about mathematical literacy. And of course, I lost it, you know. And I said to him, wait a minute. You mean your school teaches math lit? You can pay the most, you know, you have the money to pay for the most talented math teachers in the world. What the hell are you doing? You know, teaching math lit. And by the way, I said, isn't this the school? I'm not mentioning the name. Isn't this the school that gave us Mark Shuttleworth? He says, that's true, but we also gave you Herschel Gibbs. I said, go right ahead. And, you know, go right ahead. We must accommodate everyone, you know. Uh, and, and, and so on. And then I think something that is very, very important to me, at least, is South Africa has an obsession with what I call corrective knowledge, that is, trying to correct the knowledge of the past. This must be the only country in which students go apoplectic about a dead white man's statue. Who the fuck cares about a dead imperialist, you know? But you could swear their entire future depended on what to do with this fucking statue, and I don't get it. I looked at that and I said, I don't get it. And of course we have to correct the past, don't get me wrong. But that often comes in South Africa because we are powerless in terms of positioning for the future. And so even in schools in East Oakland, where there's not much going on in Northern California, you know, the kids are learning about automation, robotics. They're learning about artificial intelligence. They're learning about neurobiology. They're learning about applied mathematics, because that too is an act of social justice, positioning kids for a future in which they have to be skilled or lose out. And I had said to the Western Cape Education Department's 300 curriculum advisors on Monday, if you are so obsessed with getting kids over the line and forget that there's a program called Girls That Code in Johannesburg with girls that didn't even pass grade 12, but they are being prepared and positioned for. It hurts enormously when I go to my second home in the Silicon Valley, and I meet with South Africans that nobody's heard of, and I say, you know, this is incredible. Here's the dean, former dean of medicine at Stanford, and he went to Pretoria Boys High School, but he won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. He would never have won it here. Okay? And there's the Musk Fellow in that area, and there's many, many other South African millionaires, dollar millionaires, and they made it big there because of a culture in which the expectation is that you will do well. Let me prove to you our South African institutions. Well, those of you South Africans, I want you to be absolutely honest with me. So that I want you to get to the sense of why this nonsense continues. How many of you, when you were at a South African university, had at least one professor who would say something like, welcome to Biochemistry 352. By the end of the first semester, half of you will be gone. If you had a professor like that, just put up your hands. Now, wherever I ask that question in South Africa, how can you tell people they're gone before they started? But that is our culture, a low expectation culture, and one that, of course, is reflected in this. So what does it mean to prepare young people, not just to get over the line, but for what is too glibly called in South Africa the fourth industrial revolution? I really think you shouldn't put your money into schools that work. Put your money into schools that have the potential to do well. And those are the schools I work with in all the 9 provinces, and I'm astounded at how easy it is to turn around these schools, but we don't have the government to do that for us. Let me stop there. I'd rather take you. Oh, let me just say one other thing about universities. I think in the next few years, you will not be able to send your kid to a South African university. I've written a book about this. It's called The End of the South African University. The main title is As by Fire. And one of the reasons for that is, as somebody who's a comparativist, I study the trends in higher education around the world and around our continent. One of the reasons for that is our universities have been destroyed by a movement that started out as a noble protest movement in 2015 and became a fascist movement actually by 2016, deeply racist, deeply destructive, and has actually taken down our best universities. Now, what you need to know about universities, it takes 100 years to build up a university like Wits or UCT. It takes a weekend to bring it down. And we are struggling now, trying to understand how do you prevent further rot. So one of the deans at UCT told me the other day that when she called the top 50 students in one of the degree programs, she discovered that 30 of them who had in fact applied and were accepted decided to go elsewhere. And the reason for that is, if you look at how the year ends and the children, the students, are writing in a tent on the main sports field, surrounded by barbed wire and attack dogs and security guards. Let me tell you something about first-year parents. They send kids to university for two reasons only: a high-quality education and a sense of security. Every week, for our top universities, I write a letter of reference for a professor who has taken a job in Canada or the US or the UK because they want to get out. And when your middle-class students leave and your top professors leave, you have the University of Makerere, you have the University of Dar es Salaam, you have the University of Zimbabwe, who at one point were our top universities on the continent. So I don't see much hope for the universities, and that saddens me very deeply. But we saw this coming, and the question you have to ask yourself is, where are you going to get the high-end talent to replace you? And that is, of course, a huge question. If you want any other data on the stuff that I've talked about, feel free. That's my email address, at least while the University of Stellenbosch still exists. Thank you very much.
You can keep that. How very much. Thank you very much for that very sobering talk, Prof. Lots of questions coming through because you touched on a number of different issues, which, as you can imagine, all South Africans feel very strongly about. But I think the first key thing, you put a very clear picture on the problem in foundational education that we experience today. But other than getting the government to sort it out, which, you know, let's face it, South Africans don't have great faith that the government succeeds at what it does a lot of the time. What other alternative is there that we can look at as parents, as concerned citizens, as people who have businesses to run and are looking for new people to enter the workplace? What can we do at the micro level with an adjustment to policy at the macro level that can help turn around the problem we currently face at foundational education?
Okay, so first of all, if by foundational education you mean the first few years of primary school, that is for sure a major. You can't fix schools in grades 10, 11, and 12, which is the government's approach. You've got to fix schools by making sure the basis for numeracy and literacy are well established. And by the way, also the basis for preschool education. Now, educational research, I have to be honest, tends to be equivocal on most subjects, except on one. And that is that investments in preschool education, quality investments, pay off over the long term. And in fact, when kids come into grade 1 from two different experiences, poor quality, high quality preschool, not only is there a huge gap, but the gap never closes. So if you're going to make investments in any way, I would in Tataise in the Free State, where Jane Evans and her late husband set up this amazing network of high quality preschools. I would go and look for projects that work in terms of educational outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of the other end of the stick, I think the most important thing you must realize, there are highly talented students. You see a kid that goes to, I mean, I've looked at how this works. I come from working class families, so I sort of observe with great interest how other kids get ahead. So a complete mediocre student at, you know, Rondebosch Boys or Westerville and so on, he doesn't have to do much because his dad will call his friend, you know, at Stutterford and say, "Hey, Bob, you know, my wife tells me this is my kid, but, you know, is there anything, you can do to help me get it out?" A kid in Lavendale doesn't have that sense, okay, of what is out there and so on and so forth. So one of the things I'm working on, I hope some of you will help to support this, is to provide a network, you know, of people who've made it from different parts of the country in poor areas that can connect very talented young people. And one of the best things I've always said at university that companies can do, like Coronation and so on, is take the most talented kids from disadvantaged areas and give them internship experience. Don't pay them a cent. Make sure they get up at 7, they learn to work hard. Make sure that they observe what you do, make sure. But give kids that early exposure, that early experience. And don't ask stupid questions like the British, you know, but are our graduates oven ready? A graduate is not supposed to be oven ready. You know, a graduate is supposed to be, as the former head lecturer of the JSE once told me, he said, no, you educate them, I will train them. And so strengthening that relationship between the schools and the world of work is something that you could do very well, rather than expect people to show up totally prepared for something they need to learn.
And then one of the other more sensitive topics, a couple of questions that have come through on that. Now, clearly you're talking to a particular audience going, who probably have kids at a lot of the schools in the southern suburbs. The schools of privilege in the southern suburbs. And I think one of the concerns that parents have for kids in those schools is that there is a societal pressure to have standards lowered there in order to make the education levels in more public schools more palatable and more equal. But that is not a world-class solution for South Africa. How do you see going about addressing some of bringing up an equal basis of education? As you say, when the kids get there, the raw potential is the same early on. It's the opportunities that they get exposed to. How do you address that in a way that isn't just about lowering standards at one end, rising standards at the other, and also trying to bring together something that doesn't break the community apart, it actually brings it together?
Yeah. So I think, there's something very powerful called, in our legislation, called school governing bodies. Now, you'll notice every now and again government like Panyaza Lesotho at Gauteng, they'll try and break down the school governing bodies authority because they want everything as mediocre as everything else. So the first thing to do as a school governing body is to say to the school, here's my advice to you who have children in schools, go to the school governing body and tell the school to drop two things from the curriculum. One is math lit, the other is life orientation. Life orientation is supposed to be done at church or in a mosque or in a synagogue or in a temple, but you don't do life orientation in a school.
And you certainly don't get LO homework.
They don't get NO, but they get the highest marks, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody gets an A. Okay. It's the biggest load of crap I've ever seen. So tell them to get rid of life orientation, get lit, and free that up to say every kid who goes through this school would have had exposure to there's Stafford Marcy. I would bring Stafford Marcy in, who was the head of Google South Africa, and say, make sure that the school designs a program in which every kid has exposure to some element, even if it's just the design of an app, but to some element of this new wave of technology so that they prepare. But you cannot. This is where people, and let me just say this to parents. I see some younger folk here who probably have parents. If your kid gets 7 A's in grade 12, they're probably stupid. I'm so sorry to tell you that. Because all they've done is to prove that they can learn how to pass, often by parroting things back. Doesn't mean they're smart, doesn't mean they can think this way. It simply means they've learned the rules of the game for doing success. So I would never, we used to sort of turn away kids with 7 distinctions and send them to UCT. And we would, because the best predictor of success in university is actually a C aggregate, as opposed to these kids who are simply churning out, rote learning. And so that's the thing to do, is insist that your school sets a standard, and don't go by government standards. If you're writing, whether it's the IAB or the NSC, the government's NSC, make sure that you ensure that that school has a normative standard, let's say 65%, before we take you seriously and so on. This can be done, and we've got a school that we've taken over, by the way, in Worcester called Zwelathemba. Grade 8 kids from very, very dysfunctional primary schools, and let me tell you something, those school results have gone through the roof just by setting the expectation high. So there's no math lit, there's no LO. And in addition, but you can't just do that. You've got to give them the capacity. So I taught at the school. I taught a lesson on refraction the other day. We make it possible for every one of those kids to achieve those goals. South Africa's biggest problem, is not that we don't have the capacity within our very youthful population to do well. Our biggest problem is we don't expect much of them. And I think we can do that at school now.
Another question which relates is that if you look at the school syllabus, it's been the same syllabus for 20, 30 years. Absolutely. The world's changed. The pace of change has accelerated. We don't know the jobs that are going to be around in 10 years, let alone when our kids start working. What changes do you think needs to happen to today's education system at the schooling level in order to better prepare? You mentioned Girls Who Code, great movement around the world, but it's a lot of the boys' schools up for programming, not the girls. That's just one example. But what other changes do you see that we should have within our education system to try and make our kids more ready for a better future?
I mean, look, for me, the big thing, and because I'm so fascinated by what I see in Silicon Valley, for me, the big thing, the big future. When I was a student in that area 25 years ago, 20 years ago, the place was totally white. Okay, you go back to Palo Alto now, and the place is totally brown. Why? Because of the number of software engineers from India, okay, in Google, in Facebook, in Twitter in San Francisco, in Hewlett-Packard, everywhere these way. And the reason is they've produced enough people, with those basic skills in technology and so on, that they could basically take over. And that's why, by the way, Trump's attempt to limit immigration will hit those industries hard. He's such an idiot, that man. But he doesn't understand, that basic thing. So we've got to be smart here and sort of say, instead of having kids do woodwork and needlework, I mean, do you know there's still schools doing, what do they call this thing? Domestic. Yes.
Oh my gosh!
They've got
I'm
fancy
still
names
traumatized
for
from my
it.
childhood.
When you can buy these things at Woolies. So and what I don't understand.
Home
is,
economics.
Home economics. That's right.
Home economics.
Absolutely.
No money ever exchanged.
Yeah, for sure. So we're just completely unaware of a world that's changed so fast around us. We're disadvantaging these kids, by treading water on the curriculum issue.
But just taking it one step further as well, if you look at South Africa's current tertiary education setup, and we'll talk about the crumbling state of our universities in a little while, but should we not be building more technicons that actually promote more technical jobs, like plumbers, like carpenters, as opposed to just bachelor-type degrees? Is that not a worthwhile stream for South Africa to look at?
Probably, but let me tell you what you need to do if you set up that. So we've got this thing called TVETs, right? The technical vocational colleges, etc. They're all a disaster, right? So even when you do that, and the reason is for those things to work, you need, first of all, the latest equipment, okay? It's just like fixing a motor car. You need to have the best equipment available there on site to do that. Secondly, you need to have the best technicians who can teach it. And third, you need a culture that respects that line of thing. That's very hard in South Africa, and that's why every kid thinks getting a degree at university is the only way in which you can, get a good job. So you're absolutely correct. But this is not Germany. This is not a place in which you highly value, the kinds of skills that enable you to practice, or very early on, in fact, you don't even have to do 12 years of schooling, and become skilled and so on. So unless you change those three things, okay, you're going to get the kind of low quality, low skill, low output scenario that you see at the moment with the TVETs.
Well, it's a great opportunity for a private sector, potentially.
Exactly.
One of the big questions, and as I said to you, my mum's a teacher, so one of the key things that we always look at is the fact that, as we know, teachers around the world, as in South Africa, not highly respected, not highly paid, so the perceived value to society never gets the recognition that it really should. We've suffered a dearth of really good teachers in the country. What incentives do you see to bring more really good people back into teaching positions around the country?
Well, let me just say, this might shock you, but again, South African teachers comparatively are relatively well paid compared to teachers in almost any other African country. So it's, secondly, teachers all over the world are poorly paid. Okay?
Exactly.
So again, if I may go back to Northern California, one of the things that's happening right now as we speak is the number of teachers who have to move out, of the areas around these big plants, because they simply can't afford anymore to live there with the gentrification of the suburbs and so on. Teachers are not paid well anywhere. But what is true is that teachers who make a difference at a national level are teachers who come to school with a passion to teach, with a commitment to kids. Like something I can't understand. I mean, I've got a research program that I'm launching now, and I blame my mother. I think she just taught us poorly. She said, if they give you a check, if they pay you, you must show up. I find that a reasonable proposition. They pay you, you show up. I can tell you right now, I can take you to schools. I can take you right now to schools and I'll show you they're already closed for the day. Right now, from Mamelodi all the way through to Khayelitsha. That is so incredibly wasteful. So we have research that shows that kids in township schools get a third of the instructional time of the kids in the suburbs, 1/3. So even if the teacher spoke absolute nonsense, even if that teacher just showed up, you'd already have, some progress and so on and so forth. So if you look at the schools that we studied that actually work, the most effective schools in very poor areas, like in Bilwi, in Toyandou, or Mondale in Mitchell's Plain, or these kind of schools. What is the key factor there is, regardless of circumstances, the teachers show up and they teach. It's also true that the top schools in the country, from Soweto to wherever, top township schools, the teachers are from Zimbabwe.
Yeah. Not a great.
Math and science
Yeah.
from Zimbabwe, because they don't come
Yeah.
with the strong unionism. They don't come with an attitude. They don't come with poor quality, teacher education. They come with incredible talent. So the first thing that I would do is to make sure that you establish just the basic conditions. Just the basic condition. Namibia had this, they said, here's the minimal standards that every school must have. A teacher for every subject, a qualified teacher for every subject, a textbook in every subject, an infrastructure that doesn't crumble, where kids drown in pit latrines. Just do the basic things, okay? And then you have to make sure that the people you hire are actually high quality. So I don't think it's beyond reason to work towards a system, as in Finland, where nobody becomes a teacher without a master's degree. I think that's perfectly possible to move towards that. But if you continue to have a system in which you don't attract the best and the brightest, if they come to you guys, but they don't come into teaching, you'll always have an image problem with regards to the profession.
One of the things that happened, Neville's already talked about it, is President Zuma announced in December free education to an already overburdened, troubled tertiary education system. Just your thoughts on what that means further for the current state of our universities. And then you mentioned in your talk, it's not likely that our kids can go to a South African university. Now, that's not feasible for most South Africans. So what options do they have?
Okay, so I don't think President Zuma understands the basic concept of money. I don't think, he really thinks it's just out there and the chief calls and summons and it happens, okay? So there is a basic problem there. But let me just get a few things straight. Number one, education is never free. Somebody always pays. Mightn't be you, but somebody's going to pay. So let's just get that clear. Secondly, even for poor parents who might not pay in a fee-free school, okay, that parent still pays by virtue of things like deferred income, right? So even if that kid is just going to work at McDonald's, there's something you give up when that kid goes to school. I think it is, in this kind of political economy, it is patently stupid to have, as the student protesters want, across the board free education. First of all, my kids must pay because I can afford to pay, okay? And I must pay in such a way that other kids get an opportunity whose parents cannot afford to pay. I think there must be a sliding scale for people who are middle class, lower middle class, who can afford one kid but not two kids. There should be some payback arrangement and so on and so forth. And I do believe that if you don't have a parent who's working or a parent who's alive and you're talented, somebody's got to pay for you to succeed. So I'm clear with free education for people who are poor. That's the right thing to do. But everybody else must pay in some way. Now, the truth is, if you have free education across the board, one of the interesting studies that we've seen is that the people who benefit most from that are actually the kids at the upper end, not the kids at the lower end. So if inequality is in your, vision, that actually increases. So it's a stupid proposal at so many different levels. And what the president has actually done is destabilized these universities at the beginning of the academic year, because if you're a vice chancellor, and I was one of those for 7 years, what do you tell a kid who comes from Botshabelo or from Tabanchu or from, and says, the president said, it's free. it creates absolute chaos on our campuses. And I really hope he's not the president next week.
I think you and many more other people in the room. Talk about the current situation that we've got the universities into. Is there a way out? Has the leadership of the universities, I mean, each of us has our own view on it, but has the leadership of the universities handled the crisis situation well enough?
Look, I think, now that I've relocated to Cape Town, I hear incredible criticism of my former colleagues who are heading up universities, and some of it probably makes sense. But if you're in that seat, and you've got a Senate that doesn't support the police on campus, okay? And you've got students breaking down the door there, and on a big campus that's open like UCT's, you can come in at any point and cause total mayhem, right? And you don't want to behave in an authoritarian way because the university must be a place where you allow for dissent, okay? And you have huge loads of white guilt because you don't know how to talk to black students without feeling, that kind of pressure. And you're not very competent at managing the spot. That's why you notice the Afrikaans universities, the historically Afrikaans, you have less of a problem with protest because, they used to kragdadigheid, whereas the English liberal universities, I mean, everybody goes into a panic, because they don't know how to deal with it. And so on and so forth. UCT is now advertised, I think, 3 times for a vice-chancellor. They can't find somebody. Who the hell wants that job? Because, if you want a job, the one thing you want is professional fulfillment. You know there's going to be crap. That's true with you guys in Steinhoff. It's true for the University of the Free State and racism. It's what that's what you have to deal with, right? In trying to make it a better place. But what you don't want is death threats, which all of us have had. What you don't want is the safety of your family, in jeopardy. What you don't want is that instead of leading the university in terms of global fundraising, in terms of technological invention, in terms of getting the best professors, you're spending all of your time doing crisis management. It just takes the joy out of the job. So I'm less critical, I suppose, than Jan Public on.
But the way forward? How do you see the way forward? Because that's where we are. We are not where we are now.
The way forward is the following. You can't solve this problem with more or less money. You're only going to solve this problem with a political settlement in which the new president, whether that's Mr. Ramaphosa or anybody else, strikes a deal with these protesting groups on the one hand and says, these are the things we can and cannot do, okay? Yes, the financial picture, this is what we can do, etc., and try and work that out. And then, if despite all of these efforts to work in a way that opens up the democratic process to refiguring our universities, you still insist on wrecking these places, okay? There are consequences, period. Take all the factions out of the ANC that benefits from this kind of chaos and put your foot down. You can't solve this at the level of the vice-chancellor. You can only solve this at the level of the political leadership of the country. If we don't do that, you will see our best universities go down very quickly and the president's wife getting a degree in 6 weeks.
A doctorate. And that leads me on to our final question. You were currently named as part of the Dream Cabinet for South Africa, being Minister of Education. So, if the new president of the country called you into that position, would you take it?
Let me just tell you, you have a much better chance of the American Baptist Convention asking Osama bin Laden to open in prayer. No, I don't think that's going to happen. In part because these are political appointments, as you know, and not etc. But I have to say, I've always said no because I'm not really a politician. My instincts are intellectual or challenging. My independence means a lot to me. But I must tell you, because I see the slow-moving train, going to smash us into bits and pieces, and the economy and so on and so forth, I probably would say, yes, Mr. President, but you have to understand one thing. I don't take shit from anyone.
Yeah.
That would be my condition.
Thank you, Prof. We're going to hold you to that. Just on behalf of everyone, thank you for the work that you do. Your voice is much needed, and we need more people like you in the country to actually pull us onto a better path, which I believe we're fully capable of doing.